The massive antique clock reminded us that everything in this world is temporary. The hands of the clock, approaching midnight, announced the transitional barrier between the past and the future. Having embraced the beautiful brunette, the young man was ready to act. He claimed that he was one of those who always finishes everything he starts. Running his fingers through the beautiful curls, he dreamed that the beauty would not change her mind, because he desired her. But it was beyond her strength. After all, the man was truly handsome, and the aroma enveloping his perfect body captivated and excited her. The girl, thinking that in a little while she would be 30 years old, was ready to give herself a magnificent gift. After all, the brunette, who was constantly working, forgot about her personal life and feelings. But now she didn't want to postpone the moment of pleasure. And the man she wanted so much now reminded her that time was fleeting, and something important was slipping away from her. After all, her 30th birthday was just around the corner, and the hands of the clock were already telling of the approaching event. But now the terrible traffic jam on the road, and Monday morning again reminded her that work awaited her. With a charming smile, despite the circumstances, the head of the department entered the office. Noting that the weather was beautiful outside, she was glad to see everyone. And a colleague at work, looking back at her voice and trying to please her boss, said that the chapter was ready. The elegant woman wished everyone a good day and headed to her desk, and the staff, in response to greeting the department head, addressed her by the name of Paek Do-hee. The lady liked being called that. After all, the path she had taken to the position was thorny and difficult, and now she was enjoying the fruits of her efforts. Her slender legs and elegant brown pumps froze after walking a few meters. After all, she remembered that she had to control at what stage the brand concept project was being implemented. She was proud of her position in the company, and being addressed by her job title flattered her vanity. And the completed material was already lying on her desk. How quickly time had flown. Since joining her dream company 7 years ago, she had worked incredibly hard every day to reach the top. And this job was the price she had paid for working like a horse all those years. But there was one downside to the chain of ideal events. After all, the position was not permanent but temporary. While snacking on the go, she was not upset, but she thought about it. But the other side of the brunette was telling her to calm down. After all, it was still a reward for professionalism. And now, sitting at the table and checking the project, she understood this. And the employees, discussing the position that Do-hee got, knew why she was in a great mood. After all, the circumstances were such that the men who were applying for this position left, clearing the way for her. Young and ambitious Ha, who believed that the brunette was not worthy of this position, had already spoken out on this matter. But the girl working on the project believed that the brunette was very capable and hardworking. The guy who got up from his chair was indignant. He was jokingly saying that he wanted to envy a little. After all, doesn't the fact that a person is envied mean that he is moving towards success? The indignant one asked. But turning away from his colleague and touching his neck, he was clearly upset. And it was noticeable. Whispering in bewilderment about how it happened, he did not understand why the position was offered to the brunette, and he remained an assistant. But the beauty had 3 secrets to quickly moving up the career ladder, and she was pleased that she figured them out very quickly. In addition to productivity and outstanding success, Paek knew how to communicate skillfully and flatter amazingly, and this was confirmed by the president of the company, whom Paek ran into on the terrace. After all, he was in a hurry to congratulate her on her promotion, thanking her for her work. But the girl was embarrassed and answered that she was a temporary manager for now. Although deep down she thought otherwise. The gray-haired man, patting Do-hee on the shoulder, asked her not to think about it. After all, where there is temporary, there is also permanent, he said, smiling. Her gratitude at that moment knew no bounds. Chuckling, he lit a cigarette, saying that Paek was completely different from girls her age. Squinting, he noted that he did not take under his wing those who had not gone through the army. But the brunette was an exception. Blowing out clouds of smoke and looking at the beautiful features of the girl standing opposite him, he said that she had no equal in understanding the behind-the-scenes games. And Paek, smiling broadly, knew that she had another secret, accessible only to her. And the man was already simply guessing it, noticing that she seemed to be living her life a second time. But the president was not quite right. After all, one had lived far from her first life. After all, time was Do-hee's main resource, and the clock only showed the inner path and experience. She loved compliments, And the smile that lit up her face now was proof of that. He knew that the girl would definitely succeed. But the man didn't want to talk about that. Sensing a catch, Peck opened her eyes wide and tore herself away from the embrace of euphoria. Was her dream destined to be shattered? After all, she could have become the youngest manager. However, he had to tell the truth, because the position was to be filled by an outsider. It seemed that everything was self-deception. Her legs grew into concrete. She had no strength to walk, and the gray-haired man continued to finish off the boss with his verdict. Peck lowered her head and sank into the vacuum. All she heard in the end was his regret and the impossibility of changing anything. After all, that was the order from above. But a few minutes later, with coffee in hand, she was already sharing this news with her team. Her colleagues supported her and even tried to threaten the future newcomer. But it looked funny. Now Peck asked her to calm down and accept the situation as it was. After all, she was not going to compete with the new manager. They didn't want the brunette to suffer from such an appointment. And she, although she had been fulfilling her duties, now recommended that she get busy preparing for the meeting with the newly appointed head of the department. Remembering the president's words about her not getting angry and getting along with him, she thought about what kind of communication model to build. As she sipped her coffee, Do-hee had no intention of thinking about making friends with a stranger who was simply snatching this place out of her hands. She bit the glass with her teeth and was angry. It was unfair only because it was gender discrimination. But the spacious office was already ready to welcome a new candidate. And she, with her head down, whispered that the time had come. Turning sharply to the window, she somehow tried to hide from the sad sight for her. And the bitten glass was already flying into the basket. A man in a white shirt and brown pants walked in behind the company president. He announced that Seo Jung-won had been appointed as the new head of the planning department. And of course he wanted to introduce Peck to the new boss first. After all, it was impossible to imagine a more professional worker. But looking around the crowd of employees, he did not see the girl he had spoken to a few minutes ago. Having calmed down, the beautiful brunette was ready to look at Seo. She was interested in who was so brazenly intruding into her ideal world. Meeting the gaze of the gray-haired man, he was already introducing her to the man who looked more like a model than a new leader. His flattering words addressed to the girl flying past her ears simply fell to the floor at her feet. The reality was shocking. Confused, Do-hee looked at the young man, and the tear flowing from her eye only indicated that the brunette was shocked to the depths of her soul. She knew him, and very well. But the guy, as if nothing had happened, extended his hand to her and introduced himself. My heart sank and my legs buckled. After all, this was the man from that night, and he always saw things through to the end. After all, a year ago, showered with compliments, she allowed a man to become her partner for one night. But there were many lies surrounding this seemingly romantic story. After all, he had no idea who this girl was, especially since her name was fictitious. Peck held her breath as she looked into his eyes. She cursed fate for such injustice and wondered how to proceed. Now she didn't yet understand how she would work with the one she couldn't forget for a whole year. After all, something told her that this was a challenge to her experience. Remembering the story of how they met, the girl was already returning to a year ago, to a beautiful autumn morning on a weekend. Dreaming of getting some sleep, because she worked until late in the evening all the working days, Do-hee languidly basked in bed. But the opportunity to rest turned out to be just a dream. After all, the ringing of the phone, breaking the silence, yanked her out of her dreams, waking her up, and the voice of a close friend asked whether she was free today or not. What was the point of all these questions, the girl thought? Had she really come up with something again? But interrupting her broadcasting friend, the weather forecast reported a cool wind and falling temperatures. But what the sleepy brunette heard the next moment made her wake up. Without giving up on trying to marry Nu-ri, the mother made a blind date for the evening, and not accepting a refusal, she threatened to block all of her daughter's cards. Looking around the room, Do-hee realized that she had some cleaning to do. After all, the things that had been scattered the day before, along with the remains of food, were sadly lying on the table. Apologizing for her terrible plan, her friend asked her to go on a date instead of her. After all, the day before her boyfriend had injured his leg and needed the brunette's help. Peck's eyes widened and she finally woke up. Jumping up from the unexpected proposal, she was already screaming into the phone that Nu-ri was crazy. But the voice from the phone, calming the beauty, answered that everything would be fine, because they hadn't even exchanged photos. The persistent friend, promising to thank her with a trip to a restaurant, begged to hear and help. After all, her financial side was at stake. The brunette understood that she needed to think everything over. Being punctual, she came early. But as soon as the clock hands approached 5 o'clock, the young man who came up to the table was already asking whether she had made an order or not. The brunette, looking down, pretended to look at the menu. And the man, taking the initiative into his own hands, was already rushing to make an order at his own discretion, surprising the girl who had turned her attention to him. Looking closely at the potential groom, she was surprised by his speed. Wasn't it good manners to clarify what the lady prefers? Knowing that no one was going to take her opinion into account, she continued to look at him. Right now, Do-hee didn't want anything in particular, but he still hadn't asked her about her preferences. Placing his hand on the menu, he began a monologue. Addressing her dryly and formally, he called her by name and said that he was glad to meet them. He closed his eyes and said that his name was So Young-won. Trying to be polite, the girl replied that she was glad to meet him, but she couldn't introduce herself in return because she was already interrupted. He continued monotonously, saying that he was 32 years old and his height was 187 centimeters. The guy also had an apartment and had never been seriously ill. But as it turned out, that was not all. At the moment, the brunette's work was connected with creating a portfolio for multi-brand companies. He also considered it necessary to add that he had no special talents. After finishing, Jong-won looked up and asked the girl, who was huddled in the back of the chair, if she had any questions for him. Do-hee already understood that the guy sitting opposite her was a complete narcissistic psycho. But leaning on the edge of the table and putting on a mask of decency, she said she was glad to meet him. Smiling and copying his introduction template, she introduced herself as Lee Nu-ri. While having fun, she added that she was 29 years old and 168 centimeters tall. And if he looked closely, he would notice that the girl was healthy. She also worked as a freelance reporter, and her hobby was her work. The full moon watching the strange couple illuminated the space. But the girl kept silent about the fact that she too was turned all the way around. The modest dinner was too much to swallow, and the silence of the interlocutor was tense and alarming. But the brunette was not one of the timid. Turning to the man, she asked if he wasn't interested in learning more about her. After all, a lot of time had passed, and Jong-won hadn't said a single word. The man's infantilism was off the charts. But he really wasn't curious, he confirmed. The strange answer, without stopping the girl, made her move on. After all, she wanted to understand the nature of such meetings. If he was not interested in everything that concerned her, perhaps she was not interesting to him either. Oddly enough, he confirmed her assumption. He really was seriously ill, the girl thought, trying to get rid of the psycho as quickly as possible. It wasn't curiosity that got the better of her. She didn't understand why they had met at all. Offering to finish the strange dinner, the girl was about to leave, but the man, who had lowered his head again, asked her not to leave so quickly. After all, he had a question. She looked around and listened attentively to what else this strange subject could surprise her with. And he, not at all embarrassed, offered the girl to marry him. This was too much. Having decided to ask again about the proposal, the girl received an affirmative answer. But something was driving her to the exit, and apparently it was the instinct of self-preservation. Did he really fall in love with her at first sight? She asked at the end. To which he answered affirmatively that he had not. But now, without hiding her anger, Do-hee rudely asked why he proposed then. The man, looking up, tried to be honest. He was sure that each of them was looking for a partner for marriage. Do-hee felt her tongue sticking to the roof of her mouth. She urgently needed to drink water. She understood that Jong-won needed a wife, but under what conditions, she did not understand. And as it turned out, there really were conditions. Bringing his index finger to his lips, the young man said that the woman should not want anything from him. Looking at her interlocutor in confusion, she asked how spouses could want nothing from each other. Folding his arms across his chest and lounging in his chair, he stated that this was the main reason for his unsuccessful search. But now Do-hee knew she couldn't just leave. Trying to make sense of the chain of events that had just happened, she was about to ask a few more questions. After all, she didn't understand when she would meet such an interlocutor again in her life. She was interested to know whether Mr. So loved anyone in this life. Continuing to get to know the man, she talked about emotions that were clearly foreign to him, and also about how it was probably hard for a man to pretend to be normal. It was so ridiculous that Do-hee even felt sorry for him. Passing by him, she said that it is normal for people to have feelings, and a normal woman would never marry, submitting to his demands. But stopping her with words, he said that perhaps Do-ho believes in fate, and also in various additions to it, for example, in a fateful meeting, blazing passion, and a magnificent wedding. But her answer surprised him. Turning around and playfully looking at the man, the brunette laughed, and then added that even a baby wouldn't believe such nonsense. By putting her fingers together, she said that she absolutely did not believe in love, nor in fate. But the girl did not believe in people even more. And yes, she added, looking at her watch, 2 hours had already passed. After all, that was exactly how long she had promised to be with her friend on this blind date, the brunette thought. Complaining that she had simply wasted 2 hours of her time, she wanted to leave the cafe quickly. But apparently at some point, Jong-won realized that he didn't want to just part with the beauty. Looking back, he quietly said that they were very similar. Moreover, getting up from the table to the surprise of the brunette, the young man followed her. Coming very close, he stopped, and the girl, smelling his perfume, stopped in surprise and held her breath. But she still didn't know about the events that were waiting for her ahead. Putting his hand on hers, he said in a quiet voice that excessive curiosity does not lead to anything good. Leaning closer to her face and not letting go of her hand, he noticed that the brunette was now of interest to him. His gaze changed, and a smile, open and radiant, shone on the handsome face of the man. Offering her a drink and continuing the conversation, he invited her to the bar. She was intrigued. Sitting down at the counter, Do-hee was quick to share her friend's story. The girl's peculiarity was that she was ready to do anything for love. After all, she was ready to give everything, without reserve, money, time, and energy, to be near her loved one. Looking into her glass of wine, the brunette complained that she barely had time for herself. And that's why this relationship model didn't suit her. Do-hee had other dreams. She thought that the ideal option for her would be a man living in New York. Because she wouldn't have to date him, she would just have a great time with him a couple of times a year, she added. And she called it a relationship. The guy clarified, because he was disgusted by even the idea of allocating time to someone. And for her, such a relationship was ideal. No obligations, attachments, unnecessary correspondence, and dissatisfied looks, Do-hee summed up. She was not going to sacrifice anything for the sake of another person. After carefully analyzing the story, Jong-won couldn't understand why she, who had experience in relationships, was going on dates again. Of course, she couldn't admit that this date was not organized for her at all. But having vast experience working with people, the brunette artistically lowered her eyes and looked into her glass and admitted that she would like to live a normal life. But what about him, she thought, looking at the man who had never loved or experienced emotions, and who tried to pretend to be normal when he came on dates. But it seems that she could have redirected these words to herself. After all, it was so absurd to simply waste someone else's and her own time. It was time to end the useless date. When saying goodbye, Do-hee said that it was fun, although in reality she didn't think so. But hearing his words of regret, she decided to stay a couple more minutes. And he just wanted to say that they had not found their person before the age of 30. The man literally made her remember the self-analysis of the past years. After all, the brunette had long ago classified herself as an emotional invalid. Those who are incapable of not loving, not being loved, and even the brunette who boldly walked through life alone, became scared at such moments. The tears that came rushing in flowed non-stop down her beautiful face. Running out into the street, she sat down, covered her eyes with her hands, and began to cry. The man who came up after her, not expecting to see such a picture, was at first confused. After all, he hadn't thought that he would find the self-confident girl in such a broken state. But strangely enough, Jong-won was worried that he was the one who brought her to this state. But the girl denied his involvement, and asked to go where the brunette was going. But it looked like the young man decided to stay. Reaching his hands to her head, he gently stroked her beautiful silky hair. Opening her eyes, the beauty looked at him in bewilderment. Lifting her up under the arms, he gently pressed Do-hee to himself, and a gentle kiss on the forehead warmed the girl's soul. Oddly enough, the man felt feelings for a woman for the first time in his life, and he liked it. And Do-hee, clinging to him, enjoyed his embrace. Raising her tear-stained but crystal-clear eyes, she asked, could what they were feeling now really be love? Wanting to test her feelings, Do-hee gently touched his cheeks with her hands. For the first time, she wanted to kiss a man to understand her feelings, and not the other way around. Touching his lips, she felt relief. Stepping aside, the brunette looked at the man and said that if they didn't understand that there could be feelings between them, they would part like ships at sea. A stream of thoughts crashed down on her. Asking herself various questions, the brunette realized that there was very little time left until her 30th birthday, and she was alone. Perhaps it was on this autumn day, when the feeling of emptiness intensified and she agreed to go on a date instead of her friend, that Do-hee could meet that one person in her life. They felt they had to go further, because that spark was already igniting. The evening was ending in a posh hotel, and in room 2005 the young people, having taken off their masks, tried to see their true selves. Finding herself in the arms of a strange but charismatic man, she understood that only an endless interweaving of events had led to this moment. Looking into the girl's amazing eyes, he said that he was going to see things through to the end, so if she changed her mind, he could stop. Looking at the clock hanging on the wall, the girl understood that her time was irrevocably leaving. But now she did not understand whether 30 years was a little or a lot. Addressing Zhang-wan, the brunette said that she had never looked into people's souls. This topic was not relevant for the self-confident girl. And he, tenderly embracing the stranger, was just asking whether she could understand what was in his soul or not. She wanted to say that she was not sure, but the man, getting ahead of her and closing her mouth with a kiss, hurried to say that he wanted to get to know her better. His determination and unexpected persistence destroyed all her barriers. Now Do-hee just wanted to dissolve in feelings, especially since he constantly showered her with compliments. And the merciless hands of the clock, quickly approaching the midnight portal, were once again preparing a surprise for the beautiful brunette. Now her world was cracking, and all this on the eve of her 30th birthday. She still did not understand why she had to experience the same moments in life, but the computer was already warning that the weather would get worse, and the sharp wind would indicate that autumn was on its heels. Dangling her legs over the side of the bed, Do-hee woke up. She knew that the morning of the previous day had come again. After all, the phone call insistently forced her to pick up the receiver. She knew who was calling and what the offer would be, but now, kneeling in front of the coffee table staring at her phone, she couldn't help but wonder why, of all the moments in her life, this had to happen today. Memories insinuated themselves into her childhood. The first time this happened was when she was 7. It was a beautiful Christmas day. Her parents congratulated her tenderly and touchingly, and as a gift they offered to go to an amusement park. The little girl was delighted. After all, being a very active child, she loved this kind of games. So holding her parents' hands, she came to the park, and her mother, understanding how much her daughter loved surprises, bought her a big teddy bear. It was the happiest birthday of her life. They rode for a long time and took a lot of photos, and then something happened that changed her life forever. Opening her eyes, the unsuspecting girl was dumbfounded. After all, her parents were once again congratulating her on her birthday and offering to go to an amusement park. Looking at her parents in confusion, she understood only one thing. December 24th had happened again. But the next day, the same thing happened again. The adults seemed not to understand what was happening, and she was the only one involved in this story of return. Living in one day at a time, she became more and more afraid. It seemed to the little girl that it would never end. This was repeated about 10 times. And finally, December 24th changed to the 25th. But today the computer was once again broadcasting the weather on September 24th. And a friend was persistently asking into the phone for a blind date. Listening to Nuri, she thought that after so many loops she had experienced, she had already gotten used to them. But she was wrong. Her tears flowed like a river, and she, hearing the sobs, already stopped her speech flow, not understanding what could have happened. But the brunette was simply offended. While calming Nuri down, she said that she probably caught a cold, and her friend had no choice but to believe her, because she had never heard Do-hee cry in 15 years. She really didn't cry in front of others. After all, time going back erased the past, and from the phone again like the day before came a request to go on a date, pretending to be her. Having repeatedly gone through the time loop, she understood that there was only one way to escape from it. You need to repeat your actions as if the girl does not remember her actions, like the other people participating in the events. Do-hee knew that if she did otherwise, then as punishment for trying to change her fate, the day would repeat itself endlessly. And today, she had 2 options again. She could meet Jung-won again and act like she did yesterday, or not meet him and cut him out of her life. Having made the final decision, She refused her friend Nu-ri, citing her busy schedule. She couldn't forgive herself for showing weakness in front of a man. Not wanting to repeat the past day, she put her phone down and cried again. Sitting on the floor in frustration, she didn't understand when this madness would end. But reality was already rushing to return to Do-hee. And the first thing she brought was a message from her friend. Having visited a blind date, the girl was delighted. After all, she had met such a handsome guy, she reported. Continuing to read the messages, she was surprised that the man who came on a date kept asking if the one who came was really Nu-ri. These questions made the brunette think. Putting the phone down, she again remembered his hands and lips. Could it be that he proposed to Nu-ri, the brunette wondered. She closed her eyes and tried to fall asleep. The girl wanted to forget about everything, realizing that she would never meet Ju-won again. Day turned to evening, and the girl, without getting out of bed, waited for the time loop to change its vector. And it happened, but only on the 5th day. Through a shimmering portal of time, she burst out of September 21st. Friday, which greeted the girl, made her go to work on roads filled with cars. But this day was preparing a gift for her, which would later change her whole life. The candidate for her position introduced himself looking down, and Miss Peck, knowing almost everything about him, politely replied that she was glad to meet him. He was in a hurry to see his workplace, and the brunette had no choice but to take him there. The elevator that had arrived was already waiting for its passengers, and she was thinking only about the fact that nothing would lift her spirits today. Pressing the move button, Do-hee did not understand how this could happen. Why exactly this man, bypassing all the loops of time, actually entered her life. But suddenly she noticed hands trying to push the elevator door open. The automatic system worked and a girl entered the cabin. Wishing everyone a good morning, she apologized for the inconvenience caused, and her companions only nodded politely in response, each thinking about their own. Having come to her senses a little, Do-hee remembered that she had not clarified everything with the girl when she entered the office. Now she was interested in the order that she had instructed the employee to fill out yesterday. Smiling sweetly, the pleasant brunette reported on the work that her boss had assigned her. Moreover, she rather respectfully called her the head of the department. But realizing that in front of her was a newly appointed leader and already a former boss, she was somewhat confused and did not understand how to address them correctly. Running out of the elevator, she said goodbye, trying to quickly disappear from sight. And Jong-won, turning to Do-hee, asked her to prepare the project documentation that he had entrusted her with yesterday. Of course she would complete the task, because she was a professional. But as she headed to her workplace, the brunette overheard the female part of the team already discussing the new boss. But knowing exactly how old he was, they assumed that he was 36. But most of all, the girls liked his appearance. After all, they thought that he was incredibly handsome and also had a perfect body. They were interested in why such an imposing man was working in an office. After all, in their humble opinion, he was worthy of becoming famous throughout the country. But Peck, heading towards the team, asked to stop the farce. She absolutely did not like it when people did not use their working time rationally. The girls apologized and went back to their places. And Do-hee complained that the team was already in disarray, and they were contributing to it. She understood that after chatting all day, they might stay over time. But she made it clear that she was in control of the process, looking menacingly in their direction. For hours, the thought of him had not left her smart and beautiful head. Do-hee did not understand why he had become her new leader. After all, she so wanted to leave the man in that noose. The brunette understood that she needed to freshen up and calm down. After all, the girl knew that he didn't even remember who she was. The water flowing onto her hands brought relief. She knew that everything would be fine. After all, when time turns back, the people around her forgot about what had happened. But now a surprise awaited her. After all, the boss, leafing through documents in a canary-colored folder, was criticizing the approach to project design. Looking at the staff, he was interested in only one question. Did they always do it this way? Do-hee, who was rushing to protect her team, was already approaching Young-won. Chief Peck asked him to elaborate on what he was not happy with. But it turned out that they were in complete disarray and composed without any logic. This form had never caused any problems, she claimed. The brunette insisted that everything was fine because they had always made them like this. Putting the folder on the table and slapping it sharply with his hand, he turned to Do-hee. After all, she was the manager before him, the brunette explained. Approaching from afar, He asked her to think about why all the managers were hired from outside. Probably because, he reasoned, the company's management did not want everyone to work according to hackneyed templates. Looking intently into Peck's beautiful eyes, he spoke of reform and innovation. These may have been pompous words, but this is what the founders were waiting for, Jong-won summed up. Having gone down to the terrace, she wanted to catch her breath. After all, his active activity was beginning to frighten her. Sitting on the bench and closing her eyes, she took candies out of her cosmetic bag and devoured them with pleasure. Feeling that it was time to show her character, she tried to control herself. Thinking that time loops were not only a curse, but sometimes a blessing, she rejoiced in her soul. After all, she understood that if she acted differently than the first time, then time went back. And the day could repeat itself countless times. But Do-hee, in some cases considering it her chance, was sincerely happy. After all, one time the time loop fell on the day of an exam, and she, having passed it 21 times, entered a prestigious university with the highest scores. But on the day of the interview, the loop allowed her to pass through it 17 times, after which she confidently took up the position. Stuck in time, she could correct all her mistakes. So how could it be considered a curse, she thought. Opening her eyes, the girl peered into the distance. She still didn't understand why they had met, but she knew for sure that she had done the right thing by refusing to meet Jong-won again. The brunette was so engrossed in her work that she didn't want to waste time on any trifles. A year ago, she simply gave in to illusions, when for a second she thought that she could be loved and love. So as she gobbled up one candy after another, she praised herself for her wisdom, and also for the fact that she had absolutely no reason to suffer. While encouraging herself, she did not hear a man approaching from behind. Addressing her by her job title, he startled her with his unexpected appearance. Turning around, Do-hee saw the tender gaze of a young man. Only a man in love could look like that. But it couldn't be, because she knew it couldn't. He acted so quickly that in a minute he was standing in front of her. Taking the candy from her hands, Jong-won clearly wanted her to pay attention to him. He scolded her with a smile. He found it funny that Do-hee pretended that she could do everything herself. But what happened next not only shocked the girl, but also made her extremely angry. Bending down very low, the man lightly touched her cheek. Looking at her chocolate-smeared lips, he wanted to kiss them. But running his finger over her lips, he said that he understood what she was into. Pushing the young man away, she stood up from the bench. Her face was burning with rage and embarrassment, because this was the height of impudence. Turning away from the young man, she hurried to wipe her lips, and Jong-won hurried to say that he was already expecting her tears like last time. Do-hee suddenly remembered the events of that evening clearly. The girl couldn't stand it when someone saw her tears. But it was at that moment, when she was trying to find privacy to cry, that he caught her off guard. But there was one significant detail in this story. Of course, it could just be a coincidence. Looking sideways at her new boss, she realized that there was no point in getting worked up over trifles. So, flirting a little, she replied that she had absolutely no intention of crying over nonsense. After all, the girl had long since left her teenage years. Bowing in his direction, she hurried to leave the company that was unpleasant for her. But he did not want to let Do-hee go now. Trying to detain the girl for at least a minute, he said that she was amazing, and she knew about it. After all, in addition to being stunningly beautiful, Do-hee was distinguished by her intelligence, and like every woman, she loved compliments. And the guy was just about to shower Miss Peck with them. After all, the manager told him that the brunette did the job better than any man. But as he continued to talk about the company, he decided that it was difficult for Do-hee to impress such a sexist boss with just her abilities. After all, at 30 years old, she became the youngest department head. That's why he thought the girl was amazing. He was even more glad that he would be working with such a professional. But the way he spoke and smiled made Do-hee wary. But still, she was thinking in her mind that she had probably rushed into starting a power struggle with this man. And now she was criticizing herself, but pretending to. But out loud, she only thanked her boss for appreciating her professionalism. Her mood improved, and the cunning young man, trying to implement his plan, offered to shake hands before the fruitful start of work. He said that he wanted to do this when they met, but it turned out to be rather crumpled. As soon as their hands touched, Jong-won suddenly pulled the girl towards him. His strong embrace closed around the brunette's waist. Everything happened so quickly that Do-hee only had time to scream in displeasure. Standing in the shadow of the trees, he looked intently into her eyes. It seemed as if the world had stopped for a moment just for them. He whispered to her how beautiful she was. Pressing his face against hers, the man felt the softness of her skin and the fresh scent of her perfume. With her eyes wide open, she listened to the details of that evening, now convinced that he remembered everything, and was now playing cat and mouse with her. She needed to get drunk, because what she heard was unbearable. Her friend loudly shamed her for drinking from the bottle. The friend reminded Do-hee that they were not teenagers. She jokingly nudged the brunette, wanting her to slow down, and the disgruntled girl asked Nu-ri to stop fighting. Realizing that Do-hee was not reacting, the friend took the bottle. After all, she had not yet managed to tell the girl about the shoot. The brunette did not quite understand what relation she had to the shoot and where it would take place. The charming brunette, fixing her hair, said that this would be a special edition about saving agriculture. And since her friend's father had died, the girl asked to replace her. But drunk Do-hee was now asking to be saved before she went to film her report. And a young man in a tracksuit and mask was already entering the cafe. At the sight of him, the waitress, realizing that she had seen the guy somewhere, sighed heavily. Attempts to remember him were unsuccessful until she called a colleague for help. He recognized the guy who came as a budding golf star. But Nu-ri was already in a hurry to make a remark about his lateness. After all, ever since he became popular, he did this constantly. The young man, taking off his mask, asked for forgiveness. After all, the training ended too late. The guy looked down and complained that he was tired as a dog. He was in such a hurry to get to the girls that he didn't even have time to take the bandages off his fingers. But when he sat down at the table, he cast a curious glance at Do-hee. Realizing that she was drunk, he cheerfully asked about what had happened. But the waitress was already hurrying to their table. She was happy to greet Kang Young. After all, her entire family were his fans. Having bowed to the girl, the athlete was glad that he was becoming recognizable. Moreover, she said that the young man was even more handsome in person, but it seemed that the girl was not going to stop. Having asked for an autograph, she wanted to hang it in the most visible place. And at that moment, the dissatisfied Nu-ri was already looking skeptically at her old friend. When the moment of glory ended, he hurried to Pekto, because that's what he called Do-hee since childhood. She was sleeping on the table, her head in her arms. The guy didn't understand why the girl was so drunk, but Nu-ri assumed that perhaps her new boss was to blame. Without thinking twice, he started waking her up. He lifted Do-hee and barely held her. And she, grabbing the collar of the guy's suit with her hands, tried to look at the man who woke her up. Smiling, he did not understand what the girl was doing. She was so close but so drunk. The young man, blushing, almost kissed her. And the brunette, realizing that an old friend was in front of her, suddenly relaxed and began to speak. Perhaps she needed to quit her job. The brunette consulted with Kan Yan, but the young man was categorically against such a decision. After all, Do-hee had worked so hard for this job for so many years. He considered it a stupid idea, and Nu-ri, who was sitting opposite him, supported the interlocutor. Now the two of them were trying to figure out what the problem was with the brunette, but it was clouded by feelings that she couldn't explain. Peck wanted to forget everything, and only alcohol was her friend today. Glancing sideways at the girl, Kang Young saw how upset she was. Do-hee felt like she had drunk more than she could handle. Her head was spinning and her stomach was protesting. She urgently needed to go to the bathroom. Well, Ri offered to accompany her friend, but she refused. Slowly moving towards the restroom, she swung her arms, trying to maintain balance, and the thoughtful golfer just silently watched her go, not taking his eyes off her. A slight smile and warm feelings were mixed in his gaze. Cold water rushed into the sink. Her fingers, greedily scooping it up into her palms, tried to refresh her face. But the girl was crying again. Looking in the mirror, Do-hee did not recognize herself. After all, the brunette, constantly thinking about him, sank into depression. She remembered how his touch had thrown her off balance, her heart beating faster than usual, clearly protesting her attempts to control herself. Realizing that by some incredible chance he remembered everything, she still persistently denied the events that had happened. She remembered how Jung-won, looking into her luxurious eyes, reminded her that they slept together in room 2005 of the Lafayette Hotel. What was the point of hiding it, the man wondered. But she was hiding nothing, she just decided so. The young man was interested in how she had spent the past year. Touching her cheeks with his hands, he felt a slight tremor. Now the man knew that the girl's name was Baek Do-hee. With difficulty restraining himself from the desire to kiss the girl he could not forget, and was trying to find. He said that the previous name did not really suit her, but the next moment she pushed Jung-won away from her with force. Pretending, she said that she didn't understand what was being said. The girl was outraged and scared. She did not understand why he was behaving rudely and unacceptably. Clenching her fists, the brunette warned him that if he continued to talk like that, it would be uncomfortable for them to work. She hurried away, realizing that she was about to burst into tears. And the guy, trying to hide his true feelings behind mockery, looked after her in confusion. It was only when Do-hee disappeared from sight that he once again sank into his usual state. His eyes lost their shine and his lips froze in a silent smile. Meanwhile, tears like ice flows flowed down her face and fell onto the brunette's hands. Having retired to the toilet, she cried bitterly, not understanding how to proceed. She didn't understand how it was that he remembered her. After all, memories are erased when time goes back. And if he, like her, lives through time loops, the girl thought, covering her mouth with her hand and opening her eyes wide. This thought made her sit down, because she considered such transformations to be her specialty. Closing her eyes, the girl couldn't understand why everything had been so confusing lately. But when she came back to reality, all she could feel was her head pounding. And also, while she was not thinking clearly, she felt like she was being carried. But after a few seconds, Do-hee realized that this was being done by the most reliable person in her life. But Ion, seeing that his girlfriend had woken up, greeted her as he had in his youth. But the girl did not understand how she had ended up on his back. But as it turned out, looking at how Do-hee drank glass after glass, he understood that this was how it would be. After all, the vigilant Nuri, not having waited for her from the toilet, went after her. But she was asleep, pressed against the wall. But Kang Yang, without ceasing to smile and joke, said that if a person cannot avoid something, then he must accept the situation. Her heart pounded loudly as if protesting against such pleasure, but she only repeated his words. As she walked along the crowded and illuminated street, she gave her various pieces of advice, and her drunken brain processed them as best it could. The young golfer couldn't understand who could make the invincible Paek Do-hee get so drunk. But the answer was banal. It was a man. John stopped as if glued to the asphalt. Not believing his ears, he did not understand what man they were talking about. And there really was one guy. Meetings with whom recently brought her troubles, the girl joked. But the frustrated golfer was already losing interest in this conversation. Dryly answering that he understood, he continued to carry the precious burden home. The morning that came did not immediately bring relief. Her head was splitting, but the fingers responsible for professionalism, deftly running across the keyboard, corrected the project. Thinking about her friend's words, she hatched a plan. After all, when he advised the girl to avoid her boss, he didn't understand how difficult it was to do. Not only did they work in the same company, but they also worked in the same office. Sitting at her desk, she saw her boss giving a task to a colleague. After all, the open space of the office was created for a full view. And now, approaching the partition of Do-hee's workplace, he asked about the sales analysis report that she had to submit. But the girl sitting at the next table was telling the boss that Miss Paek had left urgently. She was clearly nervous, as this did not correspond to reality. After all, the brunette, in a great mood, was chatting cheerfully with her colleagues while eating her lunch. He dreamed of being in their place. His gaze, filled with interest, did not leave her face for a second. But she was already saying goodbye to them and getting back to work. Her playful look dissolved as soon as he handed over a folder with documentation requirements. Cutting him off mid-sentence, she said that she needed to get to work immediately. And the next moment, showing that she was busy talking to a colleague, she would say on the fly that she would send the project by email. After a while, apologizing, the girl would say that she needed to go to the toilet. This went on all day, and she felt that she was getting better. And the evening that came brought a new idea. Having finished work, she stayed on purpose so as not to run into her boss, and now she waited for him to leave. But it seemed like he was so engrossed in his work that Jung-won completely forgot about the time. This couldn't go on any longer. Slamming her hands on the table, the girl stood up and headed for the exit. As she approached the door, she glanced at the man, wishing him good night. But he pretended to have completely forgotten about her presence in the office. But a minute later, the brunette saw that he was following her. The thought that flashed through her head that she had outplayed herself completely spoiled her mood. As he drew level with Do-hee while waiting for the elevator, it was clear that the man knew what he was doing. Trying to maintain control over the situation, the brunette made a thoughtful face. His brain worked like a computer, and the first thing that came to the girl's smart head was to get out of the elevator. Not understanding what was happening, Jung-won looked at her carefully. Grimacing, she said that she had an urgent phone call, which the man, of course, did not believe was happening. Even more than that, he cursed, realizing how unfortunate the deception was. What call? What was the brunette talking about? He didn't understand the girl at all. Covering her eyes with her hands and trying to wriggle out of it, Do-hee was already coming up with a new version of deception. And now the brunette said that she forgot her phone. After all, this little trick had previously helped her avoid awkward meetings. But it was all in vain, because the brunette pointing his finger at the phone said that she was holding it in her hands. But the girl only laughed and said how sharp he was, and now there was silence between the people in the elevator. But not for long, because he started it. He was interested in how long Do-hee would avoid him. After all, it did look strange. And he, as a manager, was worried that his colleagues would start to notice that something was going on between the young people. Leaving the topic of work, he moved on to personal matters. Smiling at the girl, he said that he could tell why he remembered the events of that night. Jung-won was offering a drink, but such a simple offer already brought Do-hee back to that September evening a year ago. Because it all started with these words. He found a sobbing girl on the street. His voice was soft but decisive, and his kisses were gentle and insistent. Everything started spinning like a whirlwind. Remembering how she later regretted it, the girl decided to refuse the offer, quickly exiting the elevator. The despair that flashed in his eyes was replaced by tenderness for the girl who he liked madly. But the brunette, after walking a few steps, suddenly stopped and looked back, not understanding why she was doing this. Curiosity was surging through her. And the next moment, Do-hee was already talking about drinking soju and pajeon today, citing the fact that she was not in a very graceful mood. Now Jung-won saw a completely different brunette. He wanted so much to feel at least a bit of the warmth of the smart and independent beauty. Before he began his story, he poured himself some soju. When September 21st came for the second time, he went to the restaurant again, hoping to see the girl he couldn't stop thinking about. But realizing that a completely different person had come to the date, the man was upset. However, she insisted so much that her name was Yeon-ru-ri that I wanted to believe her. Raising the glass to his mouth, he continued, "After all, there was no other explanation for why you didn't come, except one. You, just like me, are experiencing time loops. So that's why," Do-hee recalled. Her friend had indicated in a message that he doubted that was her real name. He was surprised when he realized that he had found a person who also experienced time loops, and she, with her head down, was stunned and embarrassed. But on the other hand, she felt a surprising peace from these words. After all, when moving through time loops, people behave like puppets. And during this time, Do-hee often wondered if she had gone crazy. And now, with his arms folded across his chest, Jung-won, smiling slightly, asked how she had lived without him for the whole year. Moreover, without waiting for her answer at all and again looking tenderly at the girl, he admitted that he felt bad without her. She froze in place, looking into the eyes of her interlocutor. But he could not be stopped. After all, having abandoned thoughts of marriage, he had been looking for her for a whole year, knowing nothing about the girl. He was so fixated that she came to him in his dreams. Do-hee, completely not expecting such revelations, even stopped blinking, having come to her senses a little. Inspired by the dim light of the lanterns, she wondered why he was looking for her. After all, the chief could have pretended that nothing had happened, and everyone would have gone their separate ways. But stretching his hand to her face, he was already meeting resistance. However, the brunette was offering the girl to remember the last conversation in the hotel. After all, Jung-won was one of those who, once having made a decision, went to the end. Taking his hand away, Do-hee was perplexed and asked him to remember the words she had said a year ago. If they understood that this was love, they would move on. But if not, then each would go their own way. Squeezing her hand in his, he enjoyed her warm palms. Involuntarily bringing her hand to his lips, the man was interested in what feelings the girl had for him. And she, answering an answer with a question, was already asking Jung-won whether he would really talk nonsense again. As if he liked her. He was about to do just that, smiling broadly. But the girl's rude question suddenly stopped him. Letting go of her hand, he began to reason, trying to hide his feelings until the right moment. After all, his life was always divided into black and white, but the so-called zeros and ones. But now he did not understand who she was for him, 0 or 1. With his hands on his knees, he wanted certainty. Realizing he had been searching for an answer for a year, he was finally ready to figure it out. But the brunette who entered the conversation looking attentively at her interlocutor hurried to put everything in its place. Didn't the man realize that what happened between them was just a random incident that happened due to an unexpected set of circumstances? Do-hee said. His gaze faded, and only his lips, questioningly pronouncing the word incident, tried to force his brain to think differently. But the girl did not want to stop. This incident, she summed up, disappeared as soon as time went back, and that would have been the end of it if they had lived as before. And perhaps, after another date, he would have chosen Aya Nuri as his chosen one. Perhaps that would be right, the brunette asserted, glancing at her watch. After meeting Do-hee, it wouldn't be easy, the man said. The brunette, abruptly raising her head, looked at him, realizing that she had finally hooked the new manager. He covered his face with his hand and thought about it. Then he said that after meeting her, marriage and love, which he had always mocked, had gained weight. And now, Jung-won couldn't just talk about these things. Realizing what changes had happened to him after meeting Do-hee, he was returning to that autumn evening again. After all, when she was about to leave, she sharply noted that he had never loved anyone. The girl believed that a self-respecting woman would not marry on his terms. But now, Do-hee asked not to pay attention to those words. After all, she meant only herself, knowing her difficult character. Now the beauty sincerely asked for forgiveness for having offended him. Do-hee simply felt that way. But the man, looking into the distance, summed up that people live in captivity of their memories. She was clearly making him angry. With his fist clenched, Jung-won was already in a hurry to say that one can only forget if one erases a person from one's memory. But Do-hee, turning around and demonstratively waving her fingers, did not understand what was special about the memories. She did not see anything terrible in the fact that they slept together, especially when they were drunk. After all, they were not children for a long time. Heading towards the door, she asked the man to treat her as a colleague, and for her part, she promised that she would also consider the manager, so only her boss. But he was not satisfied with this proposal. He could not just let her go. Addressing her formally, he noticed how the girl slowed down her pace. He asked her to remember the conversation in the cafe where they talked about emotions that were alien to him. After all, she noticed then that he was trying his best to pretend to be normal, and it was obvious. And the girl was absolutely right. Because most of them, Jung-won added, really didn't make him angry, sad, or happy. Moreover, even when he saw that someone deserved pity, he didn't react at all. But Do-hee was an exception, which is why his world turned upside down when she came into his life. He surprised her, but she wanted to understand what made him worry so much about her. It was impossible to believe. Lowering his eyes once again, the man thought that the brunette looked as unhappy as he did. She covered her mouth with her hand, barely holding back her emotions. Through a fit of laughter, the girl said that it was so pathetic to attract with one's misfortune. But the next moment, turning into a fury, she was already screaming that she was really unhappy. But who is he to feel sorry for her? Do-hee added indignantly. Stepping out onto the illuminated sidewalk, she quickly walked away from this place and the man who possessed her. She believed that this connection was now finally broken. Thinking that she had never experienced such a relationship, the girl decided to take a walk. But something was bothering her. The wind blowing through her hair was so piercing that a jacket would have been absolutely helpful. And the morning of the next day, announcing its arrival, cheerfully peered into the window with warm autumn rays. She felt so cozy that she wanted to keep her eyes closed for a little longer. But the pleasant smell in someone's hands. Opening her eyes, she froze. Familiar eyes looked at her tenderly, and a calm voice asked how she slept and how she felt. After all, the girl got drunk again yesterday, the brunette added. Looking at the man in confusion, Do-hee couldn't understand if this was déjà vu and she had slept with him again. Her brain was looking for answers, but her memory was empty. The brunette clearly remembered that after parting with Jung-won, she walked for some time, thinking about the conversation. However, a call from a friend inviting her to meet urgently forced her to change her plans. Peck hadn't heard Nuri so irritated in a long time, and she, complaining, could not understand how she had not noticed her boyfriend behind the beautiful cover. After all, He had simply trampled all her expectations. Considering that she had made the biggest mistake in her life, her friend was devastated. But at that moment, Do-hee was completely unmoved by her friend's story. Drinking one glass after another, it seemed she just wanted to get drunk. And even Nuri's comments about her indifference did not stop the beauty. Moreover, when she asked her not to drink too much, no one took it into consideration. And as a result, Do-hee got drunk. But now the voice behind her gently whispered that yesterday evening had been wonderful, and the night endlessly long. She was drowning in his arms, not understanding how she had forgotten everything. Stopping on the way to the shower, Jung-won advised the brunette to strain the remaining memory. Jumping out of bed, she turned white. Strange thoughts wandered through her head. Could it be that this crazy man was following her? Do-hee thought with horror. But at that moment, the young man remembered their first meeting on a blind date. Confident and sharp, Do-hee said that they were very busy people, offering to end the acquaintance that was of no interest to anyone. Yes, the young man noticed that she was beautiful, but the girl did not interest him enough to make him want to get to know her better. It was enough for him to find a bride for the marriage his father insisted on. But he had only one condition. The girl should not want anything from him. After all, at all previous meetings, every single one of the seekers of happiness wanted a manifestation of love or interest from him. But only Do-hee, smiling a charming smile, scratched the soul with her claws, claiming that the man had never loved anyone in this life. And leaving him in the restaurant, she added that soon emotions would be alien to him, and he would pretend to be normal with his last strength. He froze in place and thought. After all, the carelessly thrown accusations made him feel completely naked. No one had the right to feel sorry for him, especially the girl he was seeing for the first time. At that moment he recalled how, as a boy, he received an unusual assignment at school. Its essence was that he had to describe his dreams and prospects for the future. Turning to his mother, he asked her to explain how to do this. But the smiling woman said that he simply had to indicate in the lines what he dreamed of becoming when he grew up. Then the boy thought about it for the first time. But contrary to his fantasies, the boy wrote sparingly and reservedly that he wanted to be an ordinary person. And there was an explanation for this. After all, despite the fact that his mother raised the boy with love and care, he did not experience emotions. But when he was little, Jung-won did not suspect that he was not like everyone else. And only after growing up did he realize the scale of his emotional coldness. Therefore, her words in the cafe, turning the young man's consciousness upside down, confirmed that Do-hee had seen through him. His imaginary everything was fine, in fact, felt like loneliness, from which the blood ran cold. But when the brunette burst into tears, he felt that for the first time in many years he felt emotions. It was incredible. He wanted to be near her, and that night in the hotel left an indelible impression on the man's soul. But the time loop had already whirled him around in a multi-day round dance, and trying to relive such emotions once again, he was rushing to a date again. But, as it turned out, to Aya Nuri. The nice girl introduced herself and knew who he was. And Jung-won understood that it couldn't be like that, because everything was subject to certain laws. She was thinking about how good the interlocutor was, and the brunette, trying to come to his senses, kept asking her name again. Unable to withstand the interrogation, she showed her passport. But the guy was already upset. After all, he hadn't learned anything about the beautiful stranger who had come on their first date. As he said goodbye to Nuri, he thought about how he had experienced time loops many times in the last 20 years, but had never been so disappointed. Sitting on the windowsill, Jung-won thought that now he would have to live in memories. So having lived 4 times the 21st of September, he moved on to the 22nd. A whole year passed before he met her again. It was an incredible feeling, and the young man did not understand how to behave correctly so as not to scare Do-hee. And now, having dinner at a diner with a friend who admired his position, he was truly glad of this turn of events. And the guy who also worked in this company was interested in absolutely everything, from the team to the atmosphere in the department. But most of all, he wanted to hear about Baek Do-hee's reaction to him taking the position that was intended for her. The guy doubted that the brunette was happy with the new boss. Jung-won, hearing the girl's name and raising his glass, wanted to know his friend's opinion about her. But the young man replied with admiration that the head of Baek is the company's trump card. After all, besides being beautiful and smart, she was a graduate of a prestigious university. And since each of her projects was quite successful, she quickly climbed the career ladder. Supporting his head with his hand, his friend looked at Jong-won carefully. Could it be that he was interested in the girl, he assumed? But before he could answer, he was already talking about the guy forgetting about her. After all, along with her high competence, and despite the fact that she always walked around with a smile, Do-hee was a terrible person. It was an interesting statement. But the guy kept talking about how many guys quit the company because the brunette had turned them down. Kang also said something about Dong-hyun, who worked as an assistant on his team, who got drunk and apparently ran into Do-hee. But the brunette no longer heard him, remembering her as she was, so real and so touching and not under the guise of time loops. He went into the past. There, a man, calming a crying brunette, said that he understood her like no one else. But he hadn't expected the aggression he saw in the restaurant when he tried to pity Do-hee. Although later, thinking about that moment many times, he smiled, amazed by her artistry. And after the girl demonstratively left, he thought that he had never acted so emotionally in his entire life. But Jung-won was ready to endure it. Sitting in the taxi, he couldn't help but think about how rationally Do-hee had learned to use the nooses. But the old driver, complaining about the bad weather and his sore knees, constantly interrupted his thoughts. Suddenly, Nu-ri, who was trying to stop his taxi, came into his field of vision. But what the man saw behind her back shocked him. Without thinking, he asked to stop the car. The driver, who did not immediately realize what was happening, groaned, but agreed. Especially since the brunette promised to raise the reward. The girl simply pounced on him, not recognizing him right away. After all, she thought the taxi was free. But seeing the brunette, she retreated and even remembered his name. But his gaze was directed at the one who was simply sleeping, sitting on the bench. Well, Ri did not immediately understand his impulse, but he was asking about what happened to Miss Peck. She did not expect that they knew each other. But the brunette clarified that they were colleagues. She was surprised by how small the world was. But the phone call that distracted the girl allowed the man to quickly come up with a plan to take Miss Peck away from her friend. After all, she urgently needed to go home. Asking not to worry, he was ready to take Miss Peck home. But she warned that their friend would come for her. She wondered how busy Jong-won was and whether he could stay until the guy arrived. Approaching Do-hee, he gently shook her shoulders. However, the girl was asleep, not reacting to him at all. But her phone persistently urged the subscriber to pick up the phone. Without thinking twice, the brunette took the call. An insistent voice was calling Pekto, not understanding where she was. He followed her and asked to clarify her location. But Jong-won just listened to the guy. Realizing that a man was following her, he thought about how to react. Looking at the sleepy Do-hee, he realized that he didn't want to share her with anyone. But the remnants of his conscience wouldn't let him do that. But as soon as he finally decided to answer, the screen went dark. Realizing that it was dead, the man smiled. After all, Providence itself intervened in the situation. It was an amazingly pleasant gift for him. But the unexpectedly breaking rain and large drops falling on the asphalt forced the brunette to come out of his stupor. The sky was crying, as was his soul wanting love and warmth. Everything fit together into a single puzzle. But on the bench sat the one who had already entered his monotonous life. And now she was wet from the pouring rain. Running up to the girl, he suddenly realized that she was crying again. Her tears rolling down her cheeks mixed with the raindrops. He loved the rain. It brought him melancholy and balanced his mood in life. Looking at the houses it washed, Jong-won enjoyed it. And in his bed, Do-hee was already coming to her senses, hurrying to escape from the clutches of intoxication. Opening her eyes, she did not understand why she saw him again. Turning over onto her other side, she muttered that now he was also dreaming about her. The brunette muttered that she wanted to forget him, but he was constantly spinning in her head, preventing her from living. Coming to the bed, Jong-won listened to her in bewilderment. Smiling broadly, he thanked fate that the girl was near him again, even in such a strange state. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he quietly addressed the girl. And as always, formally, which looked at least strange. Stroking her hair, he asked why she told him to forget about everything. Without opening her eyes but without pushing his hand away, the girl replied that she had no time to worry about trifles. He shuddered and became despondent. But in the light of the flickering lamp, she continued to talk about how, because of him, she no longer recognized herself. That's why she wanted to remain colleagues. He could not imagine parting with her. Having lived a whole year waiting to meet the one he seemed to have lost, he did not know what to do. But suddenly, jumping up and opening her eyes wide, she demanded to know why she was back in his bed. The man folded his arms across his chest and replied that he had stayed instead of her friend, who was urgently expected at home. Wasn't she grateful to him for not leaving her drunk in the rain? Having calmed down, she asked for forgiveness for the inconvenience she had unwittingly caused. Bowing, she thanked him. But Do-hee asked him to confirm the fact that there was nothing between them. She was very worried about doing something stupid like that. It was strange for him to hear such confessions, considering the state in which he met the girl, but he didn't want to let her go just like that. The brunette asked for just one kiss goodbye. He came so close to her that Do-hee shuddered. At that moment, it seemed as if her feet were stuck to the floor. But the boss was already whispering about how he suddenly wanted to do the stupid things she had mentioned earlier. He pulled her towards him sharply and tightly grabbed her surprisingly thin waist, feeling the warmth of her body. Feeling Jung-won's breath, she thought only that the man was abnormal. The brunette was terribly worried. Unable to withstand the tension, she closed her eyes. And he softly, almost tremblingly, touched her forehead with his lips. Do-hee opened her eyes in surprise. The smile frozen on his lips clearly indicated that Jung-won was joking. Laughing, he asked why the brunette had closed her eyes. But the girl was angry. Without thinking twice, she stepped sharply and forcefully on his foot. And while he was writhing in pain, she thought about what a worthless person he was. Turning around, Do-hee left, not paying attention to his questions because the girl was not going to report. She simply asked to leave her alone. Slamming the door, the brunette once again emphasized that she would not allow anyone to cross her personal boundaries. Left alone, Jung-won stood there at a loss, unable to understand how he could control this woman. Thoughts chaotically replaced one another. Closing his eyes, he knew exactly that he would do everything to win her over. And she was glad that she had finally reached home. But here, too, a surprise awaited her. After all, the waiting Kang Yong was so worried that the questions he asked were like those of a jealous man. Coming right up to Do-hee, he insistently asked what happened to her phone. But the girl, trying to calm her friend down, answered that it simply ran out of battery. But it seemed that the athlete had not slept all night, looking for her, and now wanted to clarify all the details of her mysterious disappearance the previous evening. He placed his hand on Do-hee's shoulder and looked at her carefully. And she, batting her long eyelashes, quickly came up with a version explaining her mysterious disappearance. But for some reason, now only one image popped up in her beautiful head. How Jung-won kisses her forehead, and then laughs, realizing that the brunette was counting on a completely different kiss. Blushing and angry, she was already in a hurry to hide in her apartment, pressing the door code. And John, who was following her, only heard in response that she wanted to forget this night. Opening the door, she sighed. After all, everything in her life was now in a mess. It was not surprising, her friend added. After all, she had been drinking non-stop for several days. Do-hee apologized for causing him discomfort. Remembering that she had already apologized to another man that morning, she realized that she needed to change something in her life. But looking back and looking at the guy with her charming gaze, she invited him in. Promising to cook ramen, she wanted to cheer him up and improve her own condition. She called him so affectionately that the guy blushed. And Do-hee, with her characteristic humor, assumed that at that moment the young man's heart began to beat faster. And the next day's lunch again began with a discussion of the new manager, because this topic was still quite relevant. The personal life of a handsome and lonely man did not give rest to the female audience of the office. One of the girls knew that Chief Seo had a fiancé, and when she claimed that the information was true, she cited her acquaintance with Jung-won's colleague from the previous company. Jan continued her story and said that a couple of years ago a man wanted to marry an insanely beautiful girl. But before the wedding, the couple broke up. But Do-hee, realizing that she had heard enough, cut the conversation short. Smiling, the brunette asked Assistant Yang how the presentation development for which the girl was responsible was going. Everything was ready, the girl clarified, but the excitement did not leave her. But Do-hee, rising from the table, recommended calming down, because she was confident in her colleague's abilities. Turning around, she announced with a charming smile that she was treating everyone to coffee. In response, her colleagues admired her as always, and this was what the brunette loved most of all. Slightly ahead of the girls, she heard one of them telling the other about the boss's presence at the presentation. Assistant Yan, presenting the project, said that she was now even more afraid. But the man who was catching up with her, with a box in his hands, was already preparing to add a fly in the ointment to the presentation story. Lost in thought, he did not notice the girl on his way. The blow was so strong that the petite brunette, unable to resist, sat down on the asphalt. The girl got scared and hit herself at the same time. But the man, realizing that he was guilty, apologized, helping to collect the scattered documents and objects. He approached and asked if she needed help and how she was feeling. But the girl only thanked her and replied that everything was fine. But she still didn't know what a disaster this incident would turn out to be for her. After all, by chance, in the chaos of scattered papers and objects, he will take her flash drive with the presentation instead of his own. And a few minutes later, the girl, using someone else's object, will insert it into her computer. The light from the projector brought the white canvas to life. A smiling girl in an elegant green suit, who introduced herself as Yang Jie, began her presentation. Zhang Wan, watching the assistant, was a little worried, because he had never encountered the girl's professionalism. But rereading the presentation for the umpteenth time, he was confident in the speaker. Do-hee recalled the conversation in the cafe. She realized that she knew absolutely nothing about him, not to mention the bride whom she had never heard of. But now she needed to concentrate, which she was not able to do. By inserting the flash drive into the computer, the girl announced that she would now demonstrate a demo version of the prepared video. Using it on the internet, the company was going to promote the channel on social networks. But what those present saw on the screen shocked them. A quiet murmur of condemnation rustled between the rows of colleagues. They did not understand what was happening, but Assistant Yan, standing with her back to the screen, did not immediately notice the catch. But looking at the audience, the girl understood that something out of the ordinary was happening. Turning her head to the screen, she saw a couple having sex, accompanied by characteristic sounds. It was impossible to imagine a more absurd situation. The company director looked down and was shocked by what was happening. Stumbling over his words, he could not speak. It was a scandal. The company, which had an impeccable reputation, was now clearly losing it. But the most terrible thing in this story was the fact that this was Mr. So's first serious work. And now, standing next to Yang, her head down, being criticized by the president, he clearly felt uneasy. And no arguments about her accidentally having the wrong flash drive were accepted. The president regretted that the work had been assigned to the wrong specialist. It should have been assigned to a more experienced employee. But leaving the girl alone, he was already switching to Zhang Wan. Not understanding why he did not control his subordinate, the president was extremely angry. So only apologized. Looking at the crying Yang without regret, he was once again convinced that women cannot be trusted. But Do-hee, standing behind him, did not agree with his statements. And the evening that had come was already enveloping the city in a soft blue blanket. And only the graceful moon, which had come into service, added romance to the souls of people. The planned corporate party was held in a great mood. After all, Mr. So had a copy of her presentation, and everyone saw her excellent work. The flushed president, telling an interesting story from his life, was clearly pleased. In seclusion, Do-hee, who truly believed that the girl was not guilty, called her. Realizing that she was broken, she advised her not to get upset, because this could happen to anyone. But the steps of the approaching man were already distracting her from the call. She knew who it was and understood that the man would not leave her alone so easily. Juggling a cigarette between his fingers, he said that the girl looked tired. Realizing that she did not want to keep up the conversation, he offered her a cigarette. But the brunette was surprised by such a strange proposal, because she understood that he did not know for sure whether she smoked or not. However, Zhang Wan believed that a cigarette would not hurt her. But for some reason now she decided to tell him that she quit smoking 3 years ago. And the young man, enjoying her company, was in a hurry to compliment Do-hee. He thought that she was probably a rock, having decided to do such a thing. Smiling, she already answered that she loved this compliment. And he noticed that it was not a very feminine compliment. But the girl did not agree. Because if you are smart, she believed, then you are called cunning. But if you are diligent, then you are tough. It seemed to him that he no longer heard what she was saying, because he did not take his eyes off her. After all, he wanted more than just a conversation. He put out his cigarette and approached her. and Do-hee, frightened by his pressure, was already asking why he did it, if he only lit a cigarette. Laughing, the man said that he did it for the sake of the stern Beck. But in return, touching her chin, he asked to let him kiss her. The girl, lowering her face, said that he, as always, complicated everything with his jokes. But looking passionately at the girl, he said that he was in no mood for jokes. Do-hee wanted to answer him, but the pause in his voice frightened her. She opened her eyes wide and suddenly realized that the voice was disappearing. She knew it was a sign. A little more and everything will fly backwards. People, events, emotions. But the most important thing will be that it is time to stop. After all, 5 minutes before the time loop began, her voice would break. Do-hee could always predict when it would start. And now, when it was so close, the brunette knew that time was turning back again. But what was her surprise when Jong-won suddenly reproduced her thoughts? She did not understand how he did it. But the time loop, which had come into its own, was already transporting the girl from the cozy cafe home to the bedroom bed. She stretched out her hand and sat down. And if it weren't for certain circumstances, one might think that the girl had just woken up. The clock on the phone showed 6 hours 10 minutes. Yes, it was Monday, September 28th again, and the girl had work waiting for her. Lost in thought, Do-hee remembered that she hadn't noticed any changes in him before the time loop. But he was a little pale and worried, and he also repeated over and over again that she would return this morning. Dangling her legs over the bed and looking at the cloudless sky, the brunette thought that it was not the time to be upset, because something needed to be fixed. She returned to the canteen, where she had been discussing So's failed wedding over lunch with her colleagues. But sitting at the table, Do-hee was no longer thinking about sorting out the relationship between the boss and his failed bride, but about what happened after dinner. After all, having promised to treat everyone to coffee, she rushed ahead without waiting for her lagging colleagues. Carefully examining people, she looked for the culprit of the incident. And indeed, after a few minutes, she saw the one who could create a problem at the company level, threatening her and Jong-won's reputation. Reacting quickly, Do-hee was already grabbing the unsuspecting girl into her arms, thereby changing the course of the unpleasant story. And she, completely confused, waited for an explanation. But the young man, who simply walked right on her heels, without the brunette's explanation, quickly explained the situation. The grateful girl was already showering her savior with compliments. The assistant was declaring her love to her, which looked extremely funny. Do-hee was pleased because one problem had been successfully resolved, and the flash drive with the presentation was already inserted into the computer. And confident Yan, who spent a huge amount of time on its development, announced the project with dignity. The mobile version of the channel was already popping up on the white canvas, and the girl, actively waving her hands, was ready to tell the details and show the channel in action. Those present were delighted with the work done. Understanding that the company would expand the scope of its advertising, the president thanked the team. He placed his hands on the girl's shoulders and praised her for her excellent work. After all, he never doubted that there were talented people working in the planning department. And now it was not a crying assistant, but a professional in her field who stood before the president. And he understood that he could count on John in all matters. Do-hee was pleased and jubilant, but most of all she was proud of herself, because she was the one who learned how to use time loops in her tenacious hands. The brunette turned around and left. After all, her mission was accomplished, and the grateful man looked after her with longing. After all, the man understood the price she paid for correcting other people's mistakes. All this prolonged her stay in the loops, taking away days of her life. The coming evening invited us to a corporate party, and with it a feast and a wonderful mood of the team. She crossed her arms over her chest and waited for him. But he still hadn't shown up, and this upset Do-hee. A few minutes later, she heard a familiar voice. He addressed the girl as formally as always. Now he was asking her a question that had been bothering him for many years. Did Do-hee know how to get out of time loops as quickly as possible? Of course she knew, the girl answered, laughing. It was necessary to repeat the initial actions exactly. It wasn't like she did it differently this time, the boss stated. But the fate of her colleague and the company was at stake, and she could not act differently, the brunette said. And this meant only one thing, that the day would repeat itself again. After all, for her it was like working on mistakes, Do-hee continued. She believed that she was getting a chance to fix everything by returning to the past. How could a girl miss such a gift of fate? Her answer clearly upset the man. It seemed that she didn't care how many days she would endure the loops, thought Jongwon. After all, the girl used these days to improve her life. Covering his lips with his hands, he thought only about how this time was a curse for him. Hateful and disgusting, which exhausted the man beyond belief. He didn't know how it happened, but time loops appeared for them simultaneously. And if the brunette changed her actions, then Jongwon would go through the loops again. Biting her lip, the girl listened silently. He asked to act as before without changing the events and circumstances. And for his part, he promised to maintain discipline. But Do-hee was against it. The brunette hurried to remind him that if he was a leader, he should behave accordingly. Looking at the amused assistant, she reminded him that bosses always cover for their subordinates. Gaining momentum, she added that she was not going to change anything, as long as he lived peacefully for another day. And Jongwon, without a doubt, stated that it was only Yang's fault, and the man was not going to correct other people's mistakes. He was changing before his eyes. Believing that the girl had no abilities and was making mistake after mistake, he considered what had happened to be a pattern. Couldn't Do-hee see that the girl had achieved her position not thanks to her skills? Not wanting to hear this nonsense, the brunette left. And since the event was unofficial, she could allow herself to do this. And he only added that he was not one of those who ignored such things and passed by incidents. But the girl, walking away, threw after him that she had always lived like this and was not going to change anything. Do-hee, at that moment, was extremely categorical, but he didn't want her to leave so easily. So by addressing her formally, he slowed down her impulse. Turning around, Peck's greatest fear was that there would be an order that would have to be carried out immediately. But she was wrong. 4 days later, while sitting at the presentation, Do-hee began to wonder why she began experiencing time loops with Jongwon. After all, everything was different before, and he, at that moment, not understanding how to act in tandem with the brunette, tried to think through everything down to the smallest detail. The man missed her madly but tried to keep his distance, but sometimes his gaze longingly lingered on the girl. As a result, September 28th lasted 4 days and finally turned into the 29th. However, they brought something that neither of them expected at all: coldness and a work-like attitude, devoid of emotion. And even when they met in the corridor, they passed each other like strangers. The tension grew. Do-hee knew only one way to let off steam. It was drinking with friends. She was the host. After ordering several glasses of soju and an incredible amount of snacks, the girl drank, surprising those gathered. Well, realizing that she had already seen such a scenario last time, asked what the girl was in the mood for. Was it really because of her boss again? Her friend worried. Looking at the delicious pieces of chicken, she continued to reason that if she had such a boss, she would feel the same way. After all, behind the beautiful appearance hid a terrible character. The golfer who joined the conversation did not understand who they were talking about, but Nu-ri quickly explained that it was the man she had gone on a date with a year ago, but who, by a strange coincidence, turned out to be Do-hee's boss. But the girl, still not understanding the true state of her friend's affairs, was already asking how the brunette was working under the leadership of the head of So. Looking at her friends, she didn't know what to answer. After all, her memories were already taking her back to the previous evening of October 14th. After all, at the meeting, the company's president suggested leaving the strategy to the head of PEK. After all, having seen a beautiful girl, future partners will not be able to refuse the contract. Of course, this flattered Do-hee, but realizing that in addition to her beauty, she was also smart, the girl smiled modestly. But the formidable lady, with big glasses and a bob haircut, was against such a proposal. She believed that it would be better to appoint the head of So in charge. After all, a man inspires more trust. The president, listening to her, asked Jongwon if he could prepare in time. But there was no problem. Of course, Chief So was ready. And Do-hee, clenching her fists, was angry that her competence was limited solely to beauty. But the boss inspired trust. It was unbearable. But she, smiling as always, said that she would enter the information into the protocol and send an updated list. But to herself, she thought that she had been toiling over this project since the beginning of the year. And now she felt terrible. But Jongwon only cast a guilty glance at the girl. Apparently he was used to using other people's brains, the brunette thought. He stayed late after the meeting and went into the office. Noticing that Miss Na-maken was not there, he asked Yang, who was passing by, where her colleague had gone. But there was no clear answer. Perhaps something had happened to the absent one, the worried assistant suggested. But it seemed that the man had ignored her suggestions. But the brunette working at the next desk reported that she had been absent since lunch and still was. He scolded her a little at work, and she burst into tears and probably went home, he added, currying favor with the boss. Yang was outraged by how Assistant Ha ratted on a colleague at work, considering it unacceptable. As he was leaving, So said that the girl had left her workplace without permission, and Do-hee, who was sitting with her back to him, thought with regret that the boss, not intending to look into the incident, would simply follow the procedure. The night was coming into its own. The lonely moon, companion of couples in love illuminating the dark sky, announced that it had taken its place of work until the morning. The sharp, warm shower refreshed and relaxed her body. The constant tension of the last few days had not been good for her. Standing under the shower, the brunette thought. After all, this was her favorite activity. Thin, graceful hands embracing her neck gently kneaded it. Recalling his confessions about emotional infantilism, she had already been convinced of this more than once. After all, nothing touched him at all. The hands of the clock, reminding of midnight, seemed to mock. After all, it was completely clear that this day would repeat itself again. Shaking the blanket, she prepared to fall asleep. The turban gently squeezing her wet hair promised to dry it until the morning. But one thought did not leave the girl. How could Jong-won be such a robot, she thought. The repeating morning greeted her again. Looking out the window, the girl understood that the loop would not end until she changed something. But Do-hee could not do otherwise. She was in a hurry to get to the office. After all, she had one more extremely important thing to do. Today she had to teach a lesson to a man who had become arrogant. Noticing Miss Aiken in the corridor, the brunette asked where she was rushing to, but she needed to print out the documents and hand them over to Ha's assistant before lunch. Remembering the conversation behind her back, she knew that the man had scolded her for this work, after which the girl became upset and, leaving her workplace, went home. She needed to figure out what had happened. Being a self-sufficient person, she had always done so and did not want to change anything. And even the requests of the leader of So were not an obstacle for her. Without thinking twice, Do-hee headed to the copy room. And what the brunette heard there she didn't really like. After all, Ha was morally bullying the young specialist. She justified herself as best she could. But the man's assertiveness knew no bounds. He got angry and she cried in response to his words. Having snatched the documents from her hands, Assistant Ha, without ceasing to insult the girl, advised her to think about changing her place of work. After all, he did not understand how to work with Miss Aiken, who always had tears in her eyes. Who was he to decide who should work where? Do-hee said, cutting into the conversation. She didn't understand what he was doing now. The man tried to justify himself, stumbling over his words. The man snapped and tried to leave the room. But the brunette, with her arms folded across her chest, did not give him the chance. Looking at the scattered papers, Headmistress Peck demanded that he collect them. After all, she saw who had scattered them. And Miss Aiken simply had no face. But apparently the guy wasn't going to listen to Do-hee. Turning around abruptly, she quietly remarked that if he didn't do it, the brunette would grind him into dust. And apparently these weren't just words. Now she needed coffee. Standing in the hall, Do-hee advised the upset girl never to show her tears to people. After all, after that, they immediately start looking down on you. The beautiful weather improved the mood. Thoughtfully looking out the window, the brunette reminded that you shouldn't relax. After all, the powers that be will immediately try to devour you. But Miss Aiken, rubbing her eyes, promised that she would not cry anymore, and she would also try not to make mistakes. It was funny, the brunette said, because an intern cannot do everything perfectly. Looking back, she remembered that she had made many mistakes too. But at the beginning of the path, mistakes and failures are inevitable, the brunette continued, and only later does everything become the foundation of success. Patting the girl on the back, she asked her to contact her if any problems arose. After all, Do-hee would be able to help her quickly. Miss Aiken's gratitude knew no bounds. The girl, her feet shifting on the floor, was embarrassed to say what she had wanted to say for a long time. But when she pulled herself together, she noticed that the head of Peck was her role model. Blushing but calming down and smiling, she told the brunette that someday she wanted to become like her. Having bowed, she hurried to get to work. And Miss Peck, realizing that the girl was mistaken, thought that it was absolutely not worth becoming as pathetic as she was. The sound of footsteps behind her made Do-hee turn around. She had no doubt that it was Jung-won, as she had always felt his presence. But they hadn't been in contact at all lately. The blue stylish suit suited him wonderfully. With his hands in his trouser pockets, the man invited Miss Peck to a conversation before the upcoming meeting. The fresh wind enveloping her reminded her of her favorite season. But the curious and irritated interlocutor was interested in why the brunette did this time. He still couldn't understand what mission Do-hee had come up with for herself. Leader So was clearly irritated. With her eyes downcast, she said that she remembered her path in this company and that it was not easy. Knowing how painful it was, the brunette always tried to help newcomers, understanding that they would already experience many obstacles on their way. Looking into the distance, she continued to reason about how emotional wounds remain for life. The girl believed that it is absolutely not necessary to experience everything, because it can break a person. Standing against the backdrop of a luxurious tree covered with golden leaves, the brown-haired girl knew what could happen, and therefore could not calmly close her eyes to it. She did not consider it altruism, but rather selfishness. The wind currents trying to tear off the leaves made efforts. After all, the tree was not ready to part with its clothes. So Do-hee stood her ground. After finishing speaking, and realizing that she had shaken the air again, Do-hee left the terrace. Being so close yet so far away, they parted again in silence, not understanding when the loops would end. But Jung-won was preparing a surprise for her. Now, more than ever, he wanted to take advantage of the opportunity. After all, the brunette always said that the nooses were a gift from heaven. Returning to the meeting, he knew that the president planned to assign the presentation of the product to Do-hee. After all, the strategy of seduction in her case always worked. But the old lady was already in a hurry to propose the leader to So. Behind the brunette's seemingly sincere smile, there was disappointment and anger. After all, living through her own events in loops, she could not change anything. This was a paradox and a curse. But suddenly she felt Jung-won touch her hand, completely unnoticed, under the table. His palm covered hers, gently at first, but then firmly. Do-hee froze, but he had already talked about leaving the project to the head of Peck. After all, she really knew all the nuances and the smallest details. He saw no point in taking control of the project at this stage. The brunette, not believing her ears, looked at her boss without taking her eyes off him. In addition, added the head of So, she is an excellent speaker and orator, inspiring confidence in the interlocutor. And in crisis management she has no equal. And indeed, the president absolutely agreed with the young man. After all, Chief Peck was indeed the best candidate, he said. And the brunette and Jung-won sat there, holding hands. The cloudless sky was surprisingly clear. He loved going out on the track. It helped him catch his breath and think. Lighting a cigarette, he looked back. The man knew that Do-hee would follow him, realizing that today he had disrupted the course of events. Unexpectedly for her. She was nervous, but she had to say it. The brunette thanked Jung-won for his support. After all, going against your principles is not an easy task. Putting down his cigarette, he asked how the brunette was going to thank him. And Do-hee, not understanding what he was talking about, looked at him in surprise. After all, the girl was not going to limit herself to verbal gratitude. The man clarified. And the proud brunette pretended not to understand his hints. Jung-won came so close that the girl could smell his breath and the faint smell of cigarettes. She was already worried, and she knew that he was planning something. Pointing his finger at his cheek, he smiled. Of course, he was expecting a kiss, friendly and warm. She shuddered and blushed. So that's what he meant. Why didn't she guess right away? But folding her arms across her chest, Do-hee lowered her eyes. Didn't he understand that they weren't at work? Looking closely at her face, the brunette noticed that an eyelash was lying on the girl's cheek. But running her hand over her face, she could not find it. The confused girl asked him where she was, and he asked her to come closer. Another step, and Do-hee was in his arms again. Pressing the beauty to himself, he was already tenderly kissing her cheek. The brunette was angry and yelled at him because he was driving her crazy with his actions. And Jung-won, smiling tenderly, said that he was one of those who likes to give more than to receive. Chief Seo was leaving the terrace, and the worried Do-hee couldn't understand what kind of game it was when he was pushing her away and then pulling her back. But now the girl was trying to stop him. She was clearly embarrassed when she said that today would happen again several times. After all, it was her fault now, but she was sincerely grateful. Smiling, he said that nothing could be done. So now it was his turn to use the loops to correct the mistakes. But suddenly his face lit up with tenderness. After all, now he was not alone in the loops of time. Do-hee was next to him. She felt her heart beating. It seemed to her that it was out of order. Do-hee felt the changes, but she did not yet understand how much they would change her life. And what's most surprising is that she was able to get out of the loop faster than she expected. And Do-hee didn't expect such an outcome at all. The cozy restaurant opened its doors to welcome guests. Jung-won's parents had long wanted to dine with him, and finally the opportunity arose. A beautiful woman in a luxurious dress, smiling and showering her son with compliments, radiated love. Holding the brunette's chin with her hand, it was obvious that the woman was bored. The brunette's hand, reaching out for the knife, heard the lady's words and loudly dropped it onto the table, near the plate with the dish. The father, crossing his arms on his chest, looked at his son with displeasure. After all, he had repeatedly raised the topic of marriage and had not seen a response. The serious man in glasses, reminding him that he didn't have much time left, again asked him not to delay. Moreover, Jung-won's chances were few. While eating, the brunette told his father that he hadn't met the right girl yet, and he wasn't going to marry the first girl he met. But the father heard that Yoona had returned to Korea, and now he was wondering whether the girl had called him or not. Continuing the topic of conversation, for some reason he believed that his son still had feelings for the girl he had broken up with the day before the wedding. His father's insistent offer was clearly pounding in his ears. But at that moment he couldn't tell him that he had already fallen in love with his friend's girl, a smart and very beautiful one. The food was too heavy to swallow. He put down the cutlery to show that he had finished his meal. Jung-won said goodbye, thanking him for the time they had spent together. But his father wouldn't let him leave so easily. Stopping the brunette, he asked him to visit him in the hospital at least once. After all, the guy wouldn't want to regret later that he didn't do it. Slamming the door, he hurried to leave the private area. He couldn't stand such dinners, especially now that his father was ill. Hurrying to leave this place, he thought. He was so tired of the constant reminders about the wedding. After all, this topic had not left his parents' lips for the last 2 years. But maybe now he really needed to get married, the guy thought. And the one he had never left his mind about for a minute was already entering the restaurant. She was going on a date, but not with him. When she encountered the boss, Do-hee froze, and he, dumbfounded by such a coincidence, looked at her in surprise without taking his eyes off her. At that moment she was thinking only about the fact that such coincidences are not accidental. But she was already in a hurry to ask what the man was doing here. He explained that he was at a meeting, but his curiosity about what the girl was doing there could not be hidden. Choosing her words, she also said that she had come to a meeting, but he understood that he couldn't move until he knew the truth. And the head of PEC was already rushing to inform him that she was not obliged to report to the head about her personal life. She was leaving the man, but the girl was so sorry that she had run into him today in this place. And Jung-won looked after her, confused. And the morning of the weekend, as always, began with the desire to get some sleep. Working 5 days a week, from morning to evening, Do-hee dreamed of not crawling out of bed the whole day. But her plans were not destined to come true. The persistent ringing of the phone nervously broke into the morning. And it was déjà vu. After all, Nu-ri was in a hurry to ask her friend if she was free today or not. After all, her mother, an unusually persistent woman, had once again arranged a blind date for her daughter. But the guy who had returned to her friend's life, having been poisoned by the dinner he had prepared, demanded help. Promising that the date would be very interesting, since the applicant was a professor, he made Do-hee sit down. After all, she was categorically against it, and had already told her friend about it. But Nu-ri complained that the brunette refused without even listening to the end. But she had long understood everything and did not want to act as a guinea pig again. Not understanding what she was talking about, the girl was angry. After all, she always refused her friend, the brunette suddenly remembered. And the story of how Miss Peck and Mr. So met did not exist for her. And even if Nu-ri took Do-hee to a restaurant 10 times in gratitude for the date instead of her, she still refused. But the cunning brunette was persistent and asked not to turn off the phone. She asked her to remember the limited edition watch that Peck wanted to buy. But as far as she knew, they were not produced in Korea. However, her friend had already said that she had bought it for her, knowing the girl's love for watches. Having finally woken up, the brunette swallowed her saliva. After all, this was a watch that she couldn't buy, even if she really wanted to. After all, there were things in this world that couldn't be bought, the brunette thought. These were love, friendship, and a limited edition of watches that Nuri had access to. A few hours later, a huge steak surrounded by vegetables, emitting a divine aroma, was already lying on her plate, and the pleasant voice of a man sitting opposite her was discussing the philosophy of Rousseau. An imposing man with glasses and a glass of wine in his hands, talking about the inequality of people, tried to lead Du-hee along a philosophical path. Watching her interlocutor in love with his object, the brunette ordered herself to be patient. After all, the game was worth the candle. She imagined the moment when, looking at her hand, she would see the object of her dreams. Closing her eyes, the girl was already anticipating this moment. But suddenly, turning her head to the left, she saw him. Jong-won, who turned to the waiter, was just ordering an Americano. She didn't understand what this crazy guy was doing here. Her attention was completely focused on her boss. She mentally begged him to finish his coffee and leave. But it seemed that Jong-won was in no hurry. But on the contrary, he was looking at the girl without taking his eyes off her. It was unbearable. But realizing that she was looking at her interlocutor again, the brunette began to write to her. Nervously, the girl was already scrolling through the feed, bashfully hiding her phone under the table, and her interlocutor continued to philosophize captivatingly. In his messages, he wrote that it seemed like she had come on a date again instead of her friend. Was this really one of Du-hee's hobbies, the boss joked, or had she gotten a part-time job with her friend? But the philosopher, having paid attention to the girl, finally realized that she was not listening to him at all. Moreover, she was reading the correspondence in a completely detached manner. Despite all this, the man was interested in her favorite philosopher. Raising her head and smiling, she said that she was most interested in Aristotle, and the man, jumping back on his favorite hobby horse, switched to the philosophers of ancient Greece. The interlocutor, completely immersed in science, was simply nauseating. But when he switched to quoting Aristotle, it became completely unbearable. At the mention of women being underdeveloped men, Du-hee stood up from the table. Saying that incompetent and useless people were completely against her values, she said goodbye. The smiling girl thanked him for the 2-hour lecture on philosophy, not understanding why he even came on a date. Pointing to her watch, the girl reminded the man that there was a famous phrase by Franklin about time being money, and now she was simply losing it. She waved her hand and said goodbye, not paying attention to the shouts behind her, especially since he was calling Nuri. And smiling Jong-won, looking at the confused man, remembered his date with this peculiar and proud beauty. After all, he was also deceived by her. As she moved towards the parking lot, she heard footsteps. Not even doubting that it was the leader of So, the girl asked why he was following her. But the young man calmly answered that he, like her, was going to the parking lot. Now he was not ready to part with Du-hee, realizing that she had not even had lunch because of the obsessive philosopher. So without wasting time, he invited her to have lunch with him. She turned around and looked at the pleased man. But he did not give up in his attempt to invite the girl, reminding her that they never ate together, but only drank. She didn't like the boss's pressure. She specified that she had eaten well, and her interlocutor was an outstanding professor. But the growling stomach gave away the beauty. Putting her hand on it, the girl tried to muffle the sound, and Jong-won, confirming his riddles, assumed that everything had already been digested. Therefore, he waited for a positive answer. His eyes looked tenderly at his companion. Propping his chin with his hand, he asked the girl what she wanted to eat. Without thinking twice, Do-hee invited him to her favorite restaurant, Kopchang, because she loved the dish of the same name. And she also understood that she would be quite comfortable in this place. The smell of pork sausages spread throughout the room. The waiter was so fast that in a few minutes the aromatic dish and a bottle of soju were on the table. Jong-won, looking at the alcohol, did not understand why. After offering food, it again appeared on the table, to which the charming Do-hee calmly replied that these dishes complement each other, and if the brunette does not want to, he does not have to drink. Pouring soju into a glass, she asked him about his blind date experience. The brunette felt herself becoming bolder, and the boss, without hiding the truth, said that he had stopped going on dates since he met her. Not understanding why he was carrying on, Do-hee continued walking, asking if he even went on dates, even though she probably knew the answer. At that moment, Jong-won remembered his ex-girlfriend who demanded attention and love in return. She did not share his values regarding marriage, and therefore he did not want to continue the protracted relationship. But what Do-hee said got to him. After all, he didn't hide the fact that he was tired of complaints regarding feelings. But now, having drunk a little, she didn't understand why she couldn't just say that she loved him. He folded his arms and answered her that people should be responsible for their words. He did not want to lie, and it was clear that the young man said this extremely seriously. Do-hee looked closely at his handsome face, felt his strength and appreciated his frankness. But for some reason today she felt like he was being disingenuous. And the young man did not understand how to raise the topic of marriage again. But something told him that time inexorably demanded decisions. But Do-hee, as if reading his thoughts, reminded him that he needed to get married last year. And then in the cafe he shocked her with such a statement. He confirmed that the issue was more pressing than before and there was no time left. After all, it didn't only concern him. Do-hee didn't quite understand what kind of insurmountable circumstances the man was talking about. It was obvious that the girl wanted to know about it. And the young man looking down was already telling about how his father was sick with cancer. And he didn't have long to live. Sympathizing with the leader of So, she understood that he wanted to show his father before his death that he had created a family. But it turned out to be about the inheritance, explained Jong-won, crossing his legs. Do-hee didn't understand what he was talking about yet, but she hoped for an explanation. The man, who did not hide the nuances, repeated his father's words, saying that he had promised to make a will that would be beneficial to Jong-won. And as it turned out, among his father's property, there was something that he wanted to take possession of. At that moment, looking into a glass of soju, she spoke of her surprise at how such a man would give up the presentation to her. Bringing the glass to her mouth, she continued this topic. After all, the girl realized that after this presentation, the young man could acquire contacts that would be beneficial for him. And what's more, hating time loops and realizing that they would last who knows how long, he helped her. The young man, closing his eyes, was already playing along with her. Jong-won didn't understand why he did this. But as it turned out later, she was glad of the coincidence that she was not the only one in the loops. Although over the years of temporary play, the girl got used to figuring everything out on her own. Remembering Jung-won's words about not being alone in this endless cycle of time, she now felt supported, and suddenly, unexpectedly for herself, she said that the man's very existence served as a consolation for her. Do-hee often wondered why he was the one experiencing the same phenomenon, but the one who had loved her for many years but was afraid to confess was already entering the cafe. A rather popular but modest golfer was approaching the table where his girlfriend and an unknown man were sitting. Turning around, she looked in surprise at the guy who had called out to her. And he, lowering his mask, did not understand what she was doing here without her friends. A little confused and trying to get her bearings on the go, Do-hee was choosing her words. The brunette knew that he had a training session, but, as it turned out, he canceled it, so he decided to have a snack while walking near the house. Glancing at her companion, Kang Eon said that he had never met him. Jong-won stood up and the girl introduced her boss to her best friend. Coming closer and not hiding his emotions, the young man hurried to say that he had already heard about him. But he did not expect that Do-hee and the boss would get so loaded so quickly, and so much so that he would go to lunch on weekends. They looked at each other intently, not yet fully understanding that they were rivals for the heart of a unique girl. Holding out his hand, the brunette told his interlocutor that the guy's voice was familiar to him. And if he was not mistaken, then he was the friend who followed the head of Peck when she got drunk in the pub, the chief claimed. Shaking hands, he hurried to say that he had tried to answer a phone call that evening. But to his great regret, the phone ran out of battery and the connection was lost. Ion smiled, understanding what was being said. But he was already saying that he had hoped to find out the girl's location before the phone went dead. But suddenly the smile left his face. Looking closely at Jong-won, the guy thought, what if he had deliberately dropped the call, the girl's friend suggested? But the indignant Do-hee was already inserting herself into the conversation. Didn't Yeon understand how everything could have ended if it weren't for the leader So? But Jung-won, taking the initiative and looking at the golfer, asked a question that was simply lying on the surface. He was interested in how long he had been in love with his girlfriend Do-hee. The flushed and indignant golfer did not understand on what basis his interlocutor had drawn such conclusions. But the boss already had an explanation for this conclusion. After all, when asking about the details of that evening, the guy shook his hand too tightly. But John denied his guesses. He was simply an athlete and had strong hands. After these words, Jong-won perked up. Recognizing the young man as a beginner golfer, the man was happy, because he was also interested in golf. Moreover, he really liked the matches with his participation, but the golfer, who had folded his arms across his chest, wanted to hear the story of Do-hee's rescue to the end. The brunette tried to stop the guy, but it was all useless. After all, the athlete had already asked where the girl had spent the night that night, and the boss, not intending to hide anything, replied that they had spent the night at the hotel. He understood that a scandal was about to break out, and was already prepared for it, and indeed, Kang Yong exploded. Not believing his ears, he already regretted that he had brought up this topic, but he could not stop. The golfer couldn't understand how Young-won could bring his subordinate to the hotel, drunk at that. It was too much. But Do-hee was already standing between them, telling Yeon to end the row. He did not hear the girl, but only claimed that the boss was pestering her. But she insisted that nothing had happened. It was just raining and they needed to find shelter somewhere. Turning to the manager, Soda asked for confirmation of her words. But the worried Young was already asking his opponent whether he liked Do-hee or not. The angry girl did not understand why the golfer was behaving like that. After all, they were not obliged to report to him at all, but Jong-won's calm voice said that he didn't like Miss Peck. Moreover, he claimed that they were just colleagues at work. The girl's eyes widened in surprise. Do-hee tried to figure out how to react to the man's words. Looking into his eyes, she realized that the young man's lips were lying. The night that followed brought no relief. Remembering the meeting on the blind date, she understood why they spent that night together. The passion that had arisen between the young people was looking for an outlet, but Do-hee didn't want to develop the relationship at all. So when they met again, she suggested that they forget about everything. But the man didn't agree with this decision at all. His answer was on Miss Peck's mind. She thought about what he had said, confirming that she didn't like him either. The thoughts that were racing through her brain kept her from falling asleep. Turning from one side to the other, the beauty did not understand why she felt so bad at heart. Probably because there was another question to which she could not find an answer. The brunette did not understand what he needed from her. But sleep was already covering her. She dreamed of a beautiful autumn morning, in which the sun's rays touching the glass filled the space with warm light. The overslept girl couldn't get her thoughts together. Grabbing the car keys, she realized that she could be very late if she got stuck in traffic. But the trip by public transport was the only right decision. Running out of the apartment, she rushed towards a new day. Sitting in the subway car, Do-hee was thinking about the upcoming work. But suddenly her gaze fell on the legs of the guy standing in front of her. She did not even notice when he entered. The young man's leg was injured. The brunette, rising, hurried to offer him her place. And to make sure he sat down, she said that she was already leaving. But the young man asked her not to run away so quickly. Wanting to thank Do-hee, he handed over a bottle of drink. It was so sweet that Do-hee didn't want to refuse him. Running into the company building, she thought that Monday morning was as strange and unpredictable as always. Moreover, the brunette was almost late for work. But looking at the gift, she felt that the day would be wonderful. Feeling a surge of strength, she hurried to get to work. She quickly moved her feet and hurried to the approaching elevator. But suddenly, the classic coffee-colored pumps, crossing the entrance to the enclosed space, stopped abruptly. After all, a surprise awaited her right from the threshold. The boss was already looking at the brunette. Greeting the man, she noticed that he was upset. Jong-won sluggishly and thoughtfully mumbled a response. It was noticeable that the young man was trying to concentrate and start a conversation. On the third floor, the brunette broke the silence. He spoke dryly and formally, not looking at Do-hee at all. And not about work, but about the fact that in the cafe he had answered her friend that he didn't like the girl. Smiling slightly, he admitted that it was not true. After all, it seemed that he liked her. But he was confused in his words and tried to say it correctly. Looking into the girl's eyes, he said that he really liked Do-hee. And what's more, he could no longer hide his feelings, the young man added, coming so close that she could feel his breath. The man placed his palm on the cold wall of the elevator behind her. Gently taking her chin, Jong-won said that he wanted to drown in her eyes. Do-hee held her breath and felt the distance between them shrink. She was frightened by the man's behavior, especially when he said that he wanted to burn the girl with boiling passion. But the brunette, not being one of the timid, began to be indignant, and the man didn't seem to react. He clearly intended to kiss her, and now nothing could stop the brunette. Do-hee looked at him, her heart tossing between fear and emotion. But the kiss was already closing the girl's mouth. And it was a deliberate act, because the guy seemed to be trying to convey all his feelings that had accumulated over a long time. At some point she realized that she was short of air. Another second and the girl sat up in bed. Laughing and exhaling, she realized that it was just a dream. Despair replaced joy. Pounding her fists on the pillow, she thought that she was going crazy. After all, she didn't want to believe that he was now breaking into her dreams. But looking at her watch, she realized that she was late. Jumping out of bed, Do-hee ran to get dressed and get ready for work. Grabbing the car keys and remembering how she acted in the dream, she realized that she would give up the idea of driving it. Running out of the apartment, she clearly knew that only by taking public transport could she arrive on time. Do-hee remembered that she would meet a guy on crutches in the subway car, and of course she would give him her seat. And then she would turn around, knowing that he would thank her. But along with gratitude, the young man will hand over a bottle of drink, which she will look at with surprise and fear, realizing that she is following a dream scenario. Thinking about how prophetic it was, Do-hee entered the company building. She was afraid to think that prophetic dreams were added to the time loops. The brunette understood that she would meet him in the elevator now, and the man with his eyes downcast would be timid and calm at first. And later, on the 3rd floor, he will break the silence and share his thoughts regarding his sympathy for the girl. Without turning his head or looking at her, he will say that he was not sincere when he told the golfer that he did not like her. After all, in fact, after thinking it over carefully, Jong-won would add, he had long ago realized that he liked the girl, and even liked her very much. After these words, her heart began to beat faster. Remembering the details of the dream, she knew that in another second, what the brunette feared most would begin. After all, Do-hee still couldn't forget about the attack of passion and the hot kiss of the young man. But everything went wrong. After all, when leaving the elevator, Jong-won only added that he liked her as a person, and even more so as a colleague. And in general, he really enjoyed working with her. Added the leader so. Her sigh of relief hung in the air. Relaxing, she realized that she had simply been winding herself up. Now Do-hee was analyzing why she had become so fixated on the man. The lonely companion of the night, dimly illuminating the space, was already filling it with a cold, silvery light. She was waiting for the evening because she wanted to forget, to erase his look, touch, voice from her memory. But the friend, returning Do-hee on the weekend, already knew that she had dinner with the boss. Without taking the chopsticks out of her mouth, the brunette reminded the one who went on a blind date instead of her, where she met Young-won. The girl noticed that the leader so appeared in the beauty's life more and more often, and this worried her a little. She propped her cheek up with her hands and asked Do-hee what was going on between them. The beauty, engrossed in her dinner, asked him not to pay attention to it, but Nu-ri assumed that the girl had slept with her boss. The agitated brunette looked at her friend, tearing herself away from her food. Peck thought she had gone crazy and asked her to drop the topic, and the girl, squinting one eye, was already calming the brunette down and pretending to believe her. But Nu-ri was always curious. Coming from afar, she talked about how she would like to be with a man 24/7. Resting her chin on her friend's shoulder, she described the ideal young man she dreamed of, and the only one she could cite as an example was Mr. So. At these words, the brunette choked and spilled the drink. She was angry at Nu-ri while trying to clear her throat, and her smiling friend mysteriously reported that her friend had a strange reaction to talking about Jong-won. Turning away from her interlocutor, Do-hee asked to change the topic of conversation, because of her, she could not stop thinking about stupid things. And yesterday's dream about a passionate kiss, the girl thought, did not give her any peace at all. One after another, memories brought the beauty back to the past, to that blind date that had such a continuation a year later. But now, covering her mouth with her hands, she again begged the persistent Nu-ri to stop talking about men and who slept with whom. But Kang Yong, who had been eavesdropping on them, was already indignant, realizing what his girlfriends were talking about in a public place. Without removing his hood from his head, he believed that the girls had lost all shame. A Nu-ri, quickly changing the subject, reminded him that she had not expected him today at all, since he had said he would not come. But the guy, making excuses, replied that he was not in the best shape right now, and therefore decided to take a little rest. Turning to Do-hee, her friend asked her to continue the story. She was interested in the details of where they went after lunch, However, Kang Yong, opening a can of drink, knew the end of the meeting. Getting ahead of the brunette, he said that after dinner everyone went their separate ways. But Nu-ri accused the guy of ruining all her fun, to which he only smiled slyly in response, taking a sip of his drink. That evening, for the first time, the brunette thought that if Mr. So weren't her friend's boss, then perhaps the girl would have hit on him. But the next moment, pursing her lips and looking at Do-hee, she already doubted that he would hardly take the bait. After all, the girl sitting next to her was gorgeous. Peck, looking at her friend in surprise, was interested in how she saw Jong-won and what was special about him. But Nu-ri clearly did not expect such an answer, because the brunette considered him insensitive and inhuman. Moreover, the brunette continued, "He is a tough person. It is difficult to interact with him, and it is completely unclear what is on his mind." And she also believed that there would be enough women's tears for him for a whole truck. Indeed, remembering his sad eyes, Do-hee thought that the boss was cold and hard to understand at first. She didn't know the reason why he was like that and what he had gone through. And in general, she could not even imagine a woman who could melt his icy heart. It seemed to her that this person must have a peculiar character. Putting her chopsticks on the table, she wanted to finish the conversation about Jong-won. Not having thought of anything interesting, she headed to the toilet. And the golfer, propping up his cheek and looking after the departing Do-hee, thought about what he had not said about the main thing. His gaze did not go unnoticed. Pointing her finger at Kang Yong and looking at him with her amber eyes, she said that his feelings for the girl were visible to the naked eye. She didn't understand why he didn't confess them to the brunette, but the athlete sitting opposite his friend denied everything. Moreover, he didn't understand why the girl was even getting into his personal life. The worried golfer reproached her for imposing her thoughts, but the brunette did not doubt the assumptions. Therefore, she hastened to warn that if he continued to remain silent, she would be taken away from under his nose. It seemed to her that Do-hee was already in the stage of denying her feelings for her boss, and the confused young man was completely lost, not knowing what to do. Touching the guy's shoulder, Nu-ri said that she was ready to support the athlete, but the golfer should not stand aside. After all, she had come up with a plan and was ready to share it with him while the brunette was away. But the beauty's feet, shod in beige pumps, were already approaching the table. Catching snatches of phrases, Do-hee understood that they were talking about her, and now she was in a hurry to clarify the details of the conversation with her friend. However, Nu-ri assured that they were talking about guys. The girl did not like the false answer, but as soon as she decided to sort it out, the young man interrupted her. He called out to Do-hee, trying to get her attention. Turning around, she was ready to hear his question. But the young man seemed speechless. Blushing, he searched for words. But it was obvious that the golfer was not at all ready to confess his feelings to her. But suddenly, jumping up from the barrel and lowering his eyes, Kang Yong cried out that he didn't like her at all as a friend. The dumbfounded Do-hee, looking closely at the guy, didn't understand what had bitten him.